Welcome to Jolty. I'm Maggie Wilkinson, joined today by our hosts, proven futurists and good friends, Faith Popcorn and Adam Hant. With so much uncertainty in today's world, one can't help but question, well, everything. From politics and pandemics to social justice and social media, it's hard to know whom to listen to or even more so, whom to trust. But have you ever questioned your spirituality or even the existence of God? Today, Jolty is happy to welcome John Follis, director of the documentary, Leaving God. And with that, let's jolt.
Hello, John.
Hello, John.
Let me introduce you to Maggie Wilkinson.
Hi there.
John, it's just so nice to see you. And I was so interested in the movie. And so we're so happy to have you on.
I'm thrilled to be on.
So, John, introduce yourself to our fabulous audience and tell us what you're about in a couple of minutes.
Okay. Well, first, thank you again for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I love the idea of your podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My background is in advertising. I spent pretty much my entire career in advertising in New York, working for and getting fired from some of the best agencies in the city.
I got fired a lot too. I know how that feels.
Not that much, really.
Okay, go ahead. Continue.
I started my own agency, and then I was a marketing person. I was doing consulting online for small businesses around the country. And then after 10 years of doing that, I gave myself permission to switch gears and focus on whatever I wanted to do. And that was during the time where I had been getting more involved in video. I started a new business in 2013 called Big Idea Video. And shortly after doing that, I started creating more long format storytelling videos. After a couple of years of doing that, I started thinking about the documentary Leaving God, because that has always been an interesting subject for me. Pretty much my entire life, I've been asking questions about God and trying to figure things out. So that's kind of how I arrived at Leaving God in 2017.
Wow, interesting.
So did you make this movie mainly for you as a working through process, or did you hope it would lead other people out of the cathedral?
You know, that's a good question, Adam. My hope was that the theme of it was interesting enough that people would find it interesting to watch. I think anytime you make a documentary that dovetails with a personal story, there's a personal element to it, but I definitely created it hoping that it could get out and be seen by as many people as possible.
Right, but beyond just viewership, we were hoping that people would internalize the message, question their own faith, and maybe follow your path. Was that a goal that you had in mind?
The goal of it was to get people to think, not to do anything in particular. I have to keep reminding people, despite the title of the documentary, it's not an anti-God film. It's not intended to drive people away from God. It's merely to share some of the things that I discovered in my 40-year search for God and reveal some of the conclusions that I came to and throw those out to people to maybe get them to reevaluate their own perspective.
Yeah. So how were you raised? In what religion, or what was your religious training?
Well, I was raised Catholic and went to Catholic school, Catholic junior high.
And your family was church going?
Right. We, as most Catholics of that generation, we went to school. We went to church on Sunday until I hit my high school years and started to rebel against that. My parents didn't really put up a lot of resistance to that. They were kind of feeling ambivalence themselves, although they never really wanted, I don't think they would ever admit that.
Right.
But shortly after I stopped going, it wasn't long thereafter that they started having reasons to not go to church.
They thought they were going for you on some level, and then when they realized that they weren't going for you, they became less involved themselves.
You know, that's projection, maybe.
Well, a lot of things we do, like staying married, we say we're doing it for the children anyway.
Right.
So, Maggie, you had a great question before we got on.
Yeah, John, thank you. I appreciate your background. I've got a question about stories and myths, and I'm going to provide just a little background to provide some context with that, which is I actually studied at the Vatican in my early 20s. And the priest that was my teacher was a Carmelite monk who was the Vatican Latinist. He was interviewed in the movie Religulous, Bill Maher's movie.
I love that movie.
And I think he was one of the few people that made sense in that movie, because he's being interviewed outside the Vatican gate and asked about all the crazy stories that make up the religion, a virgin birth, things like the Assumption, think of things that are, miracles. And he said, well, friends, those are just stories. They're just myths. And it reminded me a little bit of Bill Moyers and the power of myth. And, do you think that these stories or these myths can point to a truth and that they're important directionally, or no, that they really don't serve any purpose?
So whether we believe that the Red Sea parted or not, to some degree, it's comforting to have that fable as a paradigm of transcendence and escape and rebirth. So I think what Maggie is saying is whether or not we literally adhere to the myths or they're part of our lives. When you left God, you didn't leave the power of myths as a guiding principle, right?
If I may, I think one of the most interesting things about this, and really the catalyst for me for making the film, was when I discovered the Clergy Project, because I was going through a lot of self-reckoning of my own religious beliefs. I started to imagine and believe that there had to be some people in the clergy, priests, rabbis, ministers, whatever you want to call them, who also may have been going through a reevaluation of their beliefs. So when I discovered that there was actually some research done by Linda Lascola and Daniel Dennett on that subject, and started reading some of the stories of these ministers and priests who were just going through incredible emotional struggle with the fact that for their entire lives, they identified as being a conveyor of the wisdom of God and would preach the word of God on a weekly basis to hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people over time. We're starting to realize that maybe it wasn't true. It kind of answered my question about whether or not there were priests and ministers that were coming to that conclusion. So this is a major cultural shift. I think over the coming years, you're going to find more and more, not just, average people, but more and more priests and ministers. And how do you find work after coming out as no longer a priest or a minister?
Other than Faith and I and Maggie would hire them, they don't have employment prospects.
It's kind of hard to find work as some priest or minister no longer believes.
It's interesting because that relates also to the other side of the funnel, which is recruiting priests, ministers, and so forth. One of the reasons that the church is at all healthy is because of the third world, right? That's why we're seeing South America and Africa being where the growth is, and that's where the cardinals and so forth are being appointed from.
Well, the church follows the same model as Philip Morris. They start selling cigarettes wherever they can, and then when people get smart and stop smoking, then they go to third world countries.
Exactly. I think that's a good analogy. I think it's true. Look, in Western Europe, compared to the U.S., churches are empty, right? The non-Jewish population in Western Europe is dramatically higher than in the U.S.
Absolutely, yeah. There's research done that the U.S. is the most religious, industrialized country in the world. The reason for that is the subject of a post I put up on LinkedIn a couple of years ago. In doing my research, I discovered the ad campaign commissioned by the Eisenhower administration. Do you guys know about this?
No, tell us.
I forget, it was given a name, and Billy Graham was a good friend of Eisenhower and had his ear and would talk to him on a regular basis. And this was at right at the beginning of the Cold War, when the biggest fear was that we were going to be annihilated by the godless Soviet Union. And the key word in that phrase is godless, because the Soviet Union was atheists, and they made, no bones about that. So as a strategy to get the American public unified against the scary Soviet Union, is they created this campaign that was all about God. I call it the Godification of America. And that's when, every time you look at a dollar bill or look at a coin, what do you see? In God we trust. You walk into a government building or a courtroom, in God we trust. I always wondered where that came from.
There? Right.
So that "In God We Trust" was a direct thing that came out of the Godification of America against the godless Soviet Union. If you grew up in the 50s, you were just inundated with messages about God and going to church. They did, you'd go to a drive-in movie, and in addition to getting snacks and stuff, they would stick in a commercial in the drive-in that says, "Have you gone to church this Sunday?" So the budget, I think this was like in 1952, the budget was something like $8 million, which
Wow.
in today's dollars would be something like, $87 million. And they did this campaign for like 5 years. This is why our country is so steeped in religion versus the countries in Europe.
I think it was during the Eisenhower administration that one nation under God became the under God part. That
was exactly part of it. And they stuck that into the, and a lot of this really is a conflict of interest, because our Constitution, I think, is pretty specific about separation of church and state. So I think if they tried to do stuff like that now, the problem is undoing it.
Worse. Honestly, I think the court now is far more supportive of the religious integration into American life than it even probably might have been during Eisenhower. But certainly now, you're not going to find many people on the 6th District Court saying, "Take down the Christmas tree in front," or the menorah for that matter, in front of the post office.
But that explains why this country is so religious, because that was one of the most effective campaigns ever done that no one knows about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think also part of our founding mythology, and in terms of the Puritans and the role of religion in life, is pretty powerful. And it's ironic, in the UK, there's a chief rabbi. We don't have which is an official position. We don't have a chief rabbi in the US, obviously. So in some ways, religion is more formalized in Europe, and yet at the same time, it's more powerful, pervasive here. It's sort of an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, when you sneeze, what do you say? God bless you.
Right.
I mean, as I pointed out in my film, it's so baked into our DNA.
What would be the antidote to this? What would you have be different? If you're talking about how pervasive, do you think it is harmful in some way to society that it is, and that there's a better way?
I think when it starts, you look at what's happening in this country and what happened just last month with the insurrection, and the strong connection between the conservative radical powers in this country and religion. And it's hard not to think that there isn't a connection between the two. That's where it becomes a problem, when they start getting involved in our government and start, making decisions about women's bodies and, things like that, when it becomes a problem, I think.
Is it a problem around the Christmas table, though, for Christmas dinner?
I don't think it's a problem with Christmas trees. And, there's a lot of good that comes out of Christian Judeo tradition, loving your neighbor and things like that. So you can't say all religion is bad. It's just that it's really the radical aspects of it that become a problem. I don't really care what other people think or do, as long as they don't fuck around with me.
What's interesting is the change that's happened in this country since the Vietnam War. So go back to that period. Some of the most anti-war, anti-establishment, leftist politics came from the church. Daniel Berrigan and his ilk, priests like that. Now you rarely see that. Maybe you do in the third world. I think we've seen a politicization of the Catholic Church over the last couple of decades, and I think it's very much related to sort of the rise of Reaganism as well. But there's a long history of labor activism and anti-war activism on the part of the Catholic Church and priests.
Yeah, and I mean, look at the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, the Reverend Martin Luther King. I mean, that's an example of where religion has helped society, I think.
Well, like, how do people, especially like Catholics, go on with all the, child abuse they found in church?
Since I'm not Catholic and haven't considered myself Catholic for a long time, it hasn't affected me the way other people who are Catholic, I suppose. But
I think it's affected everybody that ever believed in anything.
Yeah, but I mean, this is one of it just contributes to this trend that is happening despite that, of people not walking away from traditional religion, especially the millennials. I mean, if you want to look at trends, you just compare baby boomers to millennials, and 75% of baby boomers say that they are Christian, and now it's only about 50% of baby boomers. So, you know,
Yeah.
it's going away from traditional religion, of any kind of religion.
I think if you're devout, if I was a devout Catholic and I was living through the scandal, I think there are two options. One is you say, I'm done. There's too much hypocrisy. It's like the equivalent of institutional racism, institutional tolerance. We went to the top. I don't want to be part of it. Or you say, I believe too much in the underlying principles to leave. I'm going to stay and make it better.
Right. Kind
Or
of
you
like being in the Trump administration.
I was going to say that. I was just going to say that, you know, they just say that they must be lying.
So I
So
think the rationale, I think those who stay in the Trump administration were inside the system. And the argument was that I could do more for the country by being inside than
yeah,
outside.
they said that, right?
That's a different argument that says, I'm going to take down the Catholic establishment and rebuild it because I believe in the fundamental precepts of it.
Oh, here's something. Does it always have to be science versus theology?
I guess what people struggle to do is to rationalize and make consistent a belief in religion and an acceptance of what science is telling us in a way that allows for both to enter consciousness.
Yeah, it's hard to. I mean, if you start looking at the religious teachings from a science perspective, it just you can't justify most of it.
Yeah.
I mean, you could justify loving your neighbor, certainly. I mean, that has nothing to do with science,
Sure.
I don't think.
Sure.
But when you talk about virgin birth and resurrection and miracles and stuff like that, it doesn't hold up against science. You know, people say, well, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not true. You don't see the wind and you know it's there. Well, it can be proven scientifically.
Right.
What the wind is.
Let's go back to the film for a second. In the process of making the film and the self-exploration that accompanied that, did you learn more about yourself, more about your motivations?
It really forced me to reflect on all the experiences I had and see how the dots connected.
Right.
In that sense, it was very cathartic to be
I'm
able
sure.
to
Yeah.
not only reflect it, but to communicate it, hopefully well, in the documentary.
I think the characteristics of a cult apply both to people in a faith and they also apply to people who have left the faith.
So are you asking me if I'm in a cult because I left
not
God?
literally. No, just the nature of people who have left one institution for another. Those people have certain attributes. They question, they are looking for something new. Are they similar characteristics to what brought people into the faith in the first place, except they're focused on a different objective? Fair? Is that fair, Faith?
Yeah, he's saying, do you feel you're trying to lead people out of religion?
I'm not telling people what they should or shouldn't do.
Right.
I'm not telling them that God is bad or they shouldn't believe in God. I'm just sharing my research after making this a lifelong search or 40 years of a search, sharing what I found with the Clergy Project and some interesting statistics about how things are going and maybe why things are happening, trying to connect the dots as to why churches are closing, then kind of weaving that with my own story. I think the mistake that a lot of people do, I certainly include myself among them, is that they listen to dogma.
Mm-hmm.
They allow dogma to dictate their beliefs. So I think that can be a problem. And I'm just suggesting to people, maybe they should come to their own conclusions and do some research and start thinking critically about things instead of just believing dogma.
It's not, as I said, anti-church, but you do want people to draw a conclusion, right?
I just want them to, I hope it gets people to think. That's what I say. Maybe we don't need a God to, maybe to get to the answers to the world's questions. Maybe if we think about it long enough, we have the answers within us. We don't have to go outside ourselves to a God. And it was just a question. It was just a question. It wasn't a statement.
I understand that. But that's an interesting philosophical observation because religion believes, and I think it's universal, that God is within us. So the answer is within us. It's just a different answer.
And maybe it's just a question of whether you call it God or not, you know?
Right.
Well, John, just let me say this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for spending the time with us. It's a brilliant subject.
Thank you so
you.
Say
much.
hi to Ted if you see him.
I
Bye-bye.
enjoyed it. Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.
If you'd like to watch John's documentary, visit Leaving God Film on Facebook or topdocumentaryfilms.com.